sit down most of the time. I know you stood up some of it, but I'm going to sit down. Again, my name is Chris. I've been using Angular for maybe 5 months, 4 months. Been working on a couple apps with it. I'll show you one towards the end with some really complex directives in it. But I'm just going to start off kind of slow. And directives, I think, are, when I started using Angular, they were one of the harder things for me to figure out and learn. There's a lot to them. I'm not going to be able to touch on everything tonight, but I'll get you kind of started. We already saw some directives tonight: the ng-click, the ng-include, the ng-model. Those are all directives that are built into Angular, already ready to go. I'm going to focus more on creating your own directive. So, what are directives? Directives allow us to control and manipulate the DOM. Just like the old school, I used to do like a jQuery document ready, and you would bind events to buttons and paragraphs and whatever, all your different elements. Angular takes care of that for us by providing attributes and handling the binding behind the scenes and matching up an event or a value with a particular attribute on your HTML elements. They can be invoked with custom tag element names, attributes, class names, and comments. I've never really done anything with comments or class names. I usually use tag element names or attributes. And when you kind of look at other people's source code, you'll notice that's kind of the overwhelming majority of people use. But you can use comments and class names. How does it work? So, obviously we're building single page apps here, so we're not refreshing the browser every time, using the document ready type binding methodology. So when you load something asynchronously, then Angular gets it, it looks at the DOM elements that it's loaded, and then it compiles that information into a template, and then it binds and links the controller model attributes with the template, and then it renders it into your browser. So it's a multi-step process that happens all behind the scenes. It happens pretty quickly. But it's critical to know this process when you start getting into more custom directives with a lot of functionality and things that go on. Like, for instance, if you load a template, you might want to manipulate the template before you start binding things. So it's really important to know that whole process and how it works. I'm going to focus more on kind of more simple directives. Let me just go ahead and show you the first example that I made here. This is a pretty common thing that we do every day as app developers. We want to, yeah. So we have a text input here, and we want to type into it. And then, if this is a login form, we want to be able to hit enter to submit the form, essentially. So I hit enter, and what I did is I output the display of whatever I typed in here over here. So as soon as I clicked enter in here, I essentially told the model, hey, I'm all done with this, and I invoke a function on it. Here's the HTML code. I'm not actually sure how to zoom in on this. Oh, there. Oh, okay.
So there's no form. It's not actually.
Yeah, you don't have to have a form. So I have an input. This is standard stuff here, class. I'm using Twitter Bootstrap for the CSS, so it looks pretty. So this is how my directive gets set up here. I have this enter submit, which is obviously a custom attribute. That's not a part of HTML. That's not a normal thing. So my directive is actually called enter submit, and I'm passing it a function, enter pressed, which is part of my controller over here. See, I have scope enter pressed equals function. And then the model, so whenever I'm typing into that input, it's bound to input value, is the model value. Going back at Rit's example, that would be card.number for everybody that saw that. So here's my controller. It's real simple. I just have 4 basic values. I have 2 functions because I just want to show you the difference, 2 different ways you can do the same thing. So I type in here, hit enter, and the value changes. I type in here, I hit enter, and the value changes. The value is actually outputting right here. Input value submitted, input value submitted. So I'm not setting input value submitted until I actually click enter. And if you look at the controller, scope enter pressed equals function, I'm actually setting it right here. So they're just sort of mirrored attributes. Now if we look at the actual directive, there's many different ways to write directives, and some of them are really complex, especially when you get into compiling, pre-link and post-link compiling. I'm just going to kind of stick to the more basic, simple type of directives that probably you'll be writing most of the time. Maybe 75% of the time will be stuff like this. So, earlier we saw that you can use a factory method or you can use a directive function. This is the same as, app.service as opposed to app factory service name. This is just the way that I like to do it. To me, it makes sense to say app directive. I know what I'm building as opposed to app.factory. So here's the name of the directive, and you'll notice it's enter submit camel cased, and that syncs up with my attribute name. So if my attribute name was auto-focus, then my directive name would be autofocus camel cased. The second parameter is a function, and essentially all I'm doing is returning a function. So as soon as Angular loads up the DOM and it sees that this text input here has the enter submit attribute, it's going to apply this function and bind this function with my text input. This is the exact same thing as a link function, which I'll show you right down here. These are the exact same directive, just done two different ways. I'm returning a function. I'm binding a key down. Notice I'm not using jQuery here. Angular has a jQuery Lite built into it, so you don't have to, unless you want to use more advanced jQuery type stuff like animation or some of the fancier stuff, plugins, things like that. You can usually get away with using Angular's jQuery. So I'm just binding a key down event, and if the key code is 13, anybody that's done this with jQuery knows exactly what this is. This is the exact same thing. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm passing in a second attribute. Enter submit. I'm passing in enter pressed, which is a function name which is on the controller. So as soon as I hit enter and I get the right key code, scope actually relates to the controller up here. And then I'm doing an apply method. And then I'm going to take the value of the enter submit attribute, which is enter pressed, which is a function name, and I'm going to call that on the scope. So this essentially fires off this function here, enter pressed. Now, in my browser, I have two of these. Here's the second one here, and it's a different directive name, enter submit link, and then enter press 2, which is a completely different method over here. But you can see that I'm just passing in a function name as the value of the attribute, and then that's what's actually getting called on the controller. Does that make sense? Everybody follow that?
So scope and element attributes are standard things for directives, right? And they're inferred from the DOM.
Okay, so when you have a link, this is actually the same thing. Like, I'm just returning a function here. On this one, I'm returning an object with a link function. But technically, these work the same way. But essentially, when you have a linking function, which is what happens when Angular takes your DOM and it takes the functionality you want to add to it and it binds them together. That's the linking function. Anytime you have that, it always passes in scope, which would be the scope above the directive. In this case, it's the controller. You have your element that the directive is actually on. In our case, that's the text input. And then you have attributes. which are all of these right here are getting passed in. The type equals text, class is span 4, enter submit, and ng model. So technically all of these things are getting passed in. And if we just do like a quick console log attributes, you can see that. See, we have class, enter submit link, ng model, and type. So always the scope, the element, and the attributes get passed into the link function in that order. And that's how you pass information into a directive.
So if these are the same, what can you do with the link that you can't do with the bare, for example?
Nothing, it's all the same.
It's just
If
totally
you
the
don't,
same,
if
functionally
you
the
don't,
same.
right, if you return a function, only a function from a directive, it's the exact same thing as saying, I'm returning a linking function. The exact same
If
thing.
it's just one function.
If it's just one function.
Just the same.
If you return a function as opposed to an object, it's assuming you're returning the linking function. All right, let's go on to a new one. So here we have an editable text directive. I have a controller, one controller, and it has this value here. And the value is also shown here, but I can edit it. Forget about typos. Say done, and it updates it on the controller. So let's take a look at that code. And I actually have quite a few nested directives going on here as well. So here's my HTML. Value from the controller model is text value, so this is just evaluating the value of text value, which is my scope attribute. Essentially my ng model, that's what that is. And then I just have a div here, which is editable text is the name of my directive. And I'm passing in text value, which is because you'll notice, when I type in here, I'm essentially telling it that's the ng model. And then just again, outputting it there again. So now let's look at the JavaScript. My controller is very simple. All I'm doing is storing text value, and then I have a function all done. My text value, I have a default value on it. So when I refresh the page, you'll see, here's the value, directives rock. And then I have a couple different directives. This is the primary directive here. This is editable text. So you'll see my div has the attribute editable text. And what I'm doing here is I'm going to return an object, so I'm going to get a little bit more complicated. I'm not just returning a linking function anymore. I'm actually going to do some more nitty-gritty type work in here. I'll get back to scope in a minute. Template, if anybody's ever used Backbone, or I think Ember does it as well, you do a lot of work with templates. You'll load up a template, you'll compile it, maybe an underscore template or a mustache template, but essentially you give it an HTML string, and you have variables in it, and then it compiles the template and stores it in memory. That way it can make a bunch of copies of it over and over and over very quickly. So we can do that with Angular as well inside of our directives. So what I'm doing is I'm getting an entirely new DOM structure here. And then I'm going to say replace true, which means that this div is going to get completely wiped out and replaced with this template. So this HTML code is actually going to replace the original div code that I had. So if we look at we inspect the DOM, I don't know if you guys can see this. You can see that that is actually true. So div class row, and then I have my spans, and then all this other stuff down here. So this one simple div, if you think of, anytime you embed like a Twitter widget inside of a site, or a Facebook like button or whatever, usually it's this one little tag or one little script, and then the DOM wipes that out or, replaces it with more complex data structure. That's essentially what's going on here, is that we're taking this one little div and we're getting more complex with it. So we don't have to clutter up our HTML pages, our views, with all of this nonsense. We can just provide this simple little tag right here. And that's one of the most powerful things about the directives, is that they're very reusable, they're compact, they don't clutter up your code. Yes?
Instead of having the whole HTML onto the JavaScript, that template, can
Right
you
here.
just call a partial, like view?
Yeah, you can. If I said rather than template, you can do template URL and then pass in a URL to an HTML file. It'll load it asynchronously. As soon as it's loaded, it'll then pass it through the linking functions, etc. So yeah, absolutely.
What's the impact on the loading time if you do that with many?
Well, I mean, this little amount of text right here is tiny, so that wouldn't take very long to load. Obviously, there is more time involved, but ultimately you're going to load it either in this JavaScript file or you're going to load it from an HTML later. Really, I guess it's just a design.
I was more asking about if you split it too much up into different partials, then wouldn't it increase the load time because you have to fragment?
You
mean
is that
more-
handled by packaging then?
I mean, you're going to have to load it somehow or another. It's either going to be inside of this JavaScript file, or it's going to be inside of an external HTML file. So it's kind of a design. When you're building your app, if you have 8,000 partials, then maybe people only will ever view 100 of them. Maybe it's a good idea not to put them inside your JavaScript because most people won't see them. I would go off of that more so than how many network requests do you want to make, as opposed to do you want to have really big JavaScript files?
Caching will take care of it.
Yeah, or you could use like require.js or common.js style.
You can
and
do
just
that as
put
well.
it in a different file if you just want to have
Sure.
a different file, not
Sure.
async mode.
So my template here, obviously I have several nested directives here. I have an ng show directive, I have an ng click directive, I have this tooltip directive. Let's see, what do I have here? I have another ng show, I have an ng model, I have an enter submit directive, the exact same enter submit directive that I just showed you last time. I'm reusing it here. I have another ng click here, so this directive contains a bunch of other directives inside of it. They're nested down throughout the structure here. So it's very possible to create, a widget that has all sorts of functionality using maybe 20, 30 different directives. So again, we'll go back and just take a peek at this. I'm using a Bootstrap.js for this tooltip. So whenever you hover over this text, that's my tooltip directive. You'll see that here. I have the tooltip attribute, and then the tip title is click to edit. So that's this. Now remember, because this view here may have been loaded asynchronously later down the road, we're not using document ready to bind Twitter Bootstrap functionality onto the DOM. It doesn't happen automatically like that. So that's why we have to put these kind of things inside of a directive. Typically, if you're going to load a jQuery slideshow onto a particular div, then it usually happens when the DOM is ready. But because we're doing everything asynchronously here, you put that sort of functionality inside of a directive. So once the DOM is loaded for this partial, then it links together, and then it applies the plugin or the Twitter functionality or whatever kind of stuff you want to do. And that's a really important thing to understand, is that your old school way of doing, the jQuery, document ready stuff, that stuff needs to be moved into directives, because that's when the DOM is ready, essentially. The DOM's ready inside of these directives in your linking function. So here you see I have my tooltip function, and right there I'm doing my Twitter Bootstrap tooltip, applying that to this. And I'm using the attribute tip title. So I don't know how familiar everybody is with Twitter Bootstrap things, but just little UI widgets that they have. But essentially, it's just a jQuery function, and then you pass in. I'm passing in attributes tip title, and it creates that sort of functionality there. So if I click this, this is where the ng show and ng hide comes into play. So I have ng show. This is the basic text right here. So if I'm not in edit mode, it's going to show that. If I am in edit mode, it's going to instead show this input. So you can see this is not in edit mode, so it's plain text. I'm going to click edit, now it's in edit mode, so it's a text input. I say done. So it's just toggling back that function right there. Yes, no, on, off. That function is actually here. What I did is I created a controller inside of my directive. So, we're used to controllers, inside of, wrapping around your DOM, but I'm creating a controller which is isolated scope to this particular directive here. So I can add functionality, local variables, things like that. So here on this is on the plain text, or on the button. Whenever I click it, it's going to fire the edit toggle mode, which is on my local controller here. And then I just, set edit mode to not edit mode. Change the text in the button.
What's the benefit of putting your controller inside of that?
Because it's
Inside of your
isolated.
directive.
It's isolated within a directive. So if you think of a really huge application where maybe you have a stock ticker widget, and you want to take that widget and maybe put it in various multiple different places
Right.
throughout your app, you don't want your wrapping controller to have a functionality for that particular widget every single time. Because you may have 10 different pages in your site. You don't want to have your stock widget functions inside of every single one of your page controllers. So it isolates functionality to be within your particular directive.
And are those directives available to the entire scope of the application when you set them up this way?
I'm not sure what you mean. Is
Like-
this controller?
So you're adding directives to the overall scope of the project, right?
Yeah, I could put these anywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, I could copy paste this line right here and put it in a completely different page or a different location,
controller.
wherever.
Anywhere in the app.
Yeah.
Anywhere in the app, yes. Although I do have this scope all done up here, so I do actually have, there is some functionality in this particular case, but I think the reason you asked was, why is the controller here? It's because if you want to isolate functionality and you don't want it to be tied to your parent controller, then you can create your own controller within your directive and keep things private to that particular widget.
Yeah, I like that.
And then especially when you get to nesting directives, you may have your sort of top level directive, and then it has other things underneath it. And you may want to have a controller for that top level directive that can control sub directives. It gets really deep and pretty nasty. And that's, we were talking earlier about
Circular
scope.
dependencies.
Keeping track of scope in Angular is pretty complex.
Yeah.
That definitely adds to that level of complexity there.
It's isolated using a closure, right? So the
Yes, well,
function there doesn't have any successor type methods.
right, correct. Yeah, there's no way to get into this
Yeah.
from outside of the directive. Yep. Because I'm just returning this object here. So where did I pass it? Okay, so the model, ng model is editable text, which is up here in my controller. No, that's not right. Oh, that's right. Okay. So here I have editable text. This is invoking my directive. I'm saying, this div element here is my editable text. I'm going to do all my magic here. And I'm passing in text value, which is okay, so text value is the value of this attribute. Text value is up here in my controller scope. That's what I'm actually, this is like my NG model essentially. Now, I said I would get back to this. When you pass in your attributes, there's different ways to pass them in. By default, it's just evaluated, like pretending like you're putting your attributes in the curly braces, and it would essentially be directives rock. If it evaluates scope text value, it would be directives rock. But instead what I'm doing here is I'm saying the editable text attribute value is set to this equal sign here. So that's like saying whatever the name, whatever the value of that is, text value, I'm going to bind bidirectionally between the scope controller and whatever I want to apply it to down over here. So inside of my directive, you'll see I said ng model equals editable text, which is the attribute name right here. So whatever the value of this is, make that my ng model. In this case, it's evaluated the text value. So that's how I'm able to change this here inside of my directive, and then it actually changes it on the scope. Does that make sense? I have a bidirectional binding between, now watch this. If I were to say, there's three things you can do here. You can do an @ sign, you can do an equal sign, or you can do an ampersand. The two most common ones you're going to use are ampersand or @ signs, which is the default, or an equal sign, which is a binding. So if I did an @ sign here, watch what happens here. See, it just says text value because it's thinking that I'm literally passing in a string here as opposed to a scope or a variable. Now if I put this in double curlies, it's going to actually evaluate what the value of that is and pass that in. And that's directives wrong.
What is the ampersand for?
The ampersand is for if you want to be able to invoke a method on your controller without, there's other ways to do it. I actually prefer the other ways, which is why I don't really use the ampersand. But if you pass in like a method name and say the ampersand, then it'll treat it as a function on your controller scope. Your parent scope.
Right now, you're using an interpolated or your interpreted value, right?
Yes.
So if you change that right now, it shouldn't bind to the original.
Right.
Okay.
Correct. You got it. So, it changes locally here, but it doesn't. There's no binding between the model and the directive. So that's what the ampersand does. It literally takes a string value and passes it in, and that's it. When you use the equal sign, that's when you can use the bidirectional binding. What did I do? Oh. Aha. See? Because I passed the value in as curly braces, it's like I don't know what's going on. This doesn't make any sense to me, and it actually probably threw an error. Yes. Because it's expecting a variable, some sort of binding, but all I'm doing is passing it a string because I have this in double curlies and it's evaluating it. So I just want to pass in the raw variable name. This is one of the things that confuse me a lot too, is when to use the curlies, when to use the variable name, what sort of binding do I want to use, the @ equals, etc.
How's their documentation overall?
I mean, it's pretty robust, but it's pretty hard to understand. It's very technical. It's complicated. It's complicated. And I've actually found, like, a lot of times if you read from the bottom of the page to the top, a lot of times, seriously, a lot of times it makes more sense to me. I don't know why. Especially on the directives page, because they start talking
Give you the
such
bottom line.
technical
They start doing
terms
CS
that you're like, I have no idea what they're talking
It's
about.
like reading a PhD dissertation. It's incredibly hard.
Yeah, it's just
to
really,
understand.
it's very scientific, the way that they write. But if you read from the top to the bottom, from the bottom to the top of the directives page, I think you'll have a better understanding of everything.
So starting with the example first at the bottom?
Exactly, you want to start with examples, yes. Exactly. All right, so does everybody understand this? I used a template to replace my original HTML element. I'm isolating the scope of the attribute values that I'm passing into it here. And I also have a controller, which is isolated inside of my directive and allows me to do any sort of manipulation I want without breaking anything outside of it.
So the scope of the controller is the outer div in the template, right?
This here?
Well, the controller that you define there.
Yeah, this controller?
Its implicit scope is the outer div of the template.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, essentially, so, typically you write a div and you say ng controller equals my controller. That's essentially what it is. I'm saying, kind of saying like ng controller is this controller here for the main wrapper for that particular directive.
One other thing on the directive you use replace true.
Yes.
Does that mean that on line 22 of the text right there, that text value in the braces
Yep.
is basically doesn't really matter?
It gets wiped out.
It's right
Yeah,
there.
yeah. And yeah, I'll go ahead and, that's a good question. I'll change this to false. And that didn't seem to do anything. Yeah, I'm not sure why that's doing that. It's a good question. It should be showing up.
As a quick experiment, maybe wrap that as a preview, add a filter to case on.
What's that?
So
Oh,
differentiate it. Not that one, the one right there, yeah. Just type copy case on, so we know it's different.
yeah,
Isn't it
nothing's
because
happening.
it doesn't have a dot, it's not the same element, because it's in a different scope?
No, that's probably right. Yeah, I think it's because I have this controller. Yeah, it's because I have this. It's because I have this.
Values are different, right?
I have this controller and it's taking over. Oops. No.
No, I
No,
think
that's a
it's
good question.
because of
I
the
don't know.
Isolated scope. I think it's because of the isolated scope that goes to.
I think replace to is replace the element itself.
Say that?
To replace the element itself.
Replace the element itself.
Yeah.
If you make this
I was
text
just
value
curious.
not a variable, but sort of an object, then the text value inside.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
If you saw it flash up there for a second, so that was with replace is true. If we do replace false,
Now it shows up.
actually it doesn't matter because anything inside of this div is going to get wiped out no matter what.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
the replace changes. If I say don't replace it, then it's going to stick the code in here. And this div editable text is still going to remain.
Yeah.
If I say replace true, it's going to get rid of this and inject in this place my template. So that's good. Thank you. I've learned something on that. Okay, so just one more quick example here. So this is just another example of sort of multi-layered directives. If you wanted to build like a keyboard, for instance, I have a simple unordered list. I have a couple styles up here. And I have list items, and I have ng repeat, which is another directive that you'll use over and over and over and over and over. That's how you you take an array of data and then spit it all out into a list. So I'm saying for every key in the keys, which is from my controller, I had this piano key custom attribute or custom directive, and I'm passing in a note variable and a note attribute and an on-press attribute. And then I'm passing in variables from here. Does everybody know what ng repeat is? Everybody uses that quite often? Okay. So essentially my point of this one was that you can use directives over and over and over and over again, especially in ng repeats. You're going to use them quite a bit. So you want to add specific functionality to something that you're repeating over and over. So, and they all have their own sort of variables passed into them. So my controller function, I just set up my keys, storing what the last pressed one was, and then I have a function for key pressed. My directive is just as simple. I'm returning a linking function. Again, I could just return a function if I wanted to. And then for the element, which is actually the list item, because I'm running the ng repeat on the, I'm running the ng repeat on the list item. So the element is the list item. And just binding a mouse down event. And then I passed in the onPress function, or onPress attribute, and I'm saying I want to use the key pressed function from the controller scope. I'm going to pass in key note variable. So scope apply attributes onPress. Whatever the onPress value is, it's going to fire that up on the scope up here, or just key pressed. So that's a pretty simple one. But you're going to be using your directives inside of repeaters quite often. So, and going back to that previous example, the more complex one, it had its own controller scope. You might want to try to think of an example where you do something like that, but you would, I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but you might want to repeat something and then have functionality specific to each one of those repeated elements. So you could use your own controller scope. Totally replace the template again if you wanted to, etc. Any questions on that one? Okay, so now I'll just show you a quick example of, this is an app that I've been working on, and it uses a lot of the directives that we just saw. I'll just kind of point them at you as I go through here. I have an autofocus directive, which focuses the first input right here. I actually have the directive is on this text input, just autofocus, and then I just return a function and then say element focus. That's it. Quite simple. Here I have my enter submit function. So I'm just going to hit enter and it's going to submit the form, my basic login form. Let me go ahead. There's nothing fancy on this page. Okay, this page here is full of tons of directives. Right here I have a Twitter pop-up directive that gives you a little tooltip when you focus in on that particular text input.
Can I ask real quick, is that the only way to use the Twitter bootstrap functions, is to make a directive with Angular? Or can you can't just put that attribute right on the element like you will?
It doesn't work that way because you can for the initial page load, it'll work.
Okay.
But when you start loading and doing, hashbang URLs and things like that, Twitter doesn't know, the JavaScript function for Twitter doesn't know that a page load event happens, so it doesn't bind anymore.
So compiling a list of a bunch of commonly used directives is a good way to create a library. Like Angular
Absolutely.
UI is basically a set of directives. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah, and Angular UI, I think they kind of have like a sub-branch that does all the Twitter binding for you and things. Yeah, exactly.
I got a question.
Yes.
When you logged in, was it a new page load, or were you basically still on the same page?
No, I'm still on the same page the whole time. Yeah. And like I was talking earlier, using the service, I have an auth service. So the login actually, as soon as you submit the login form, it's using a node backend. It authorizes you or not, and then if you are authorized, then it tells the auth service, hey, this is the user that's logged in. Go ahead and let him start browsing around and load up the new UI. Otherwise, if you, like for instance, if you were logged out and you tried to deep link to this, it'll kick you back out to the login page because the auth service says, no, I don't have a user. And because it's a service and it's persistent throughout the entire app lifecycle, that's the singleton nature of it. So these sides here, you'll notice I changed the color here, and it's actually changing the colors of the sides. Here I have a lot of uploads in this application, so I created a directive to, I can type in a URL here, or I can upload a file. Oh, I'm not connected to the internet. That would be a problem. Well, anyway, it sends it off to the node backend, and then it posts it on the CDN, and then it replies back and says, okay, here's the URL on the CDN of the file that you just uploaded. So I'm changing model attributes here, and it's changing the actual layout of the page essentially, using data binding and custom directives. So let's say I want to, just to give you a quick background, this is a tool to allow you to create custom advertisements essentially. So you can upload your pictures on the side, like you have side skins, you have top skin, you can create rising stars, banner ads, all different types of banners. And we wanted to allow people to write custom HTML code, either in the sides or the top or wherever they wanted to. So I'm going to go ahead and you'll notice as I'm typing this, you probably can't really see it on that monitor. Let me do something quick. Okay, so up here I have a custom iframe directive, which is anytime I change this text input, I change the value, I essentially wipe out the iframe that's up here, draw a new one, built to the dimensions that I input, set the background color to this color, and then I inject this HTML code into that iframe. So that happens every time I do a keystroke. So you see as I'm typing, it's actually changing the code up there. And this is inside of an iframe. It's not really going to work because it's using an about blank page. But so that's a custom directive there. Unfortunately, the internet's not working. But if I uploaded images to the sides of this, I can turn resizing on. And whenever you resize your browser, the images on the side resize. And that's a totally another custom directive that applies a lot of kind of funky math to calculate the dimensions of what it's supposed to do. This is actually, I have all of my directives for that app in one file, and this is essentially all of them. So here's my autofocus that I had on the login form, which is very simple. Just returning a function, focusing on the element. Here's my enter submit function from earlier. Username input doesn't allow you to, so when you're filling out your form and you're adding a new user, user, you can, I'm only letting them type letters and numbers basically. Here's a basic input directive, which says, it basically writes a new template where you pass in a label, it creates a label and a text input together. So rather than having to manually every single time type a label and type an input, you just pass in the values that you want. I want my label to say this, and I want my model, my text input to be this. So it's kind of like code consolidation. Here's my HTML iframe directive, which is the one I was showing you where you're typing and it replaces the iframe dynamically. What I'm doing here is I'm observing. In your controllers, there's a thing called a scope watch, scope $watch, which will do something, run some sort of function anytime a particular attribute in your scope changes. Directives, you use attributes observe rather than watch. So what I'm saying is, anytime the model attribute changes, run this function right here. So to go back to this, anytime I change the model and I start typing something, it's essentially firing off that function that I told it to do. Here, let me skip that one. That was pretty long and ridiculous. Okay, here's the uploadable URL, the one that I was showing you where you can, type in a text input to a URL, to a file, where you can upload it. So here I have on my scope, I'm actually doing a couple different things. I have my model, which is a bidirectional binding, and then I have accepted file types, these other kind of attributes here that I just want to interpret it as strings. Here I'm using a custom template. And then on this one I'm using a compile function, which is similar to a linking function. The post compile function is essentially a linking function. I actually could probably put it in there. But this is what I was saying before, there's many different ways to build your directives. You can use a linking function, you can use the controller, and you can use a compile function. Excuse me a second. So this one's pretty hefty here. I'm actually using jQuery in here, and I'm binding a lot of different things. I have this. I'm using a plugin. I don't remember the actual name of it. It's some kind of jQuery file uploading plugin. So here I'm, passing in all the attributes. What happens when there's progress on the upload? What happens when it's done? That's sort of a standard jQuery plugin, initialization. But again, that has to happen inside of the directive, like you were asking. That's a good example of using a jQuery plugin and binding it that way. Pop over, this is the Twitter thing right here. That's that. Hex color, this is a directive to change the little box to the right as you type in a color. This is a slightly older version of the app, but I also added another jQuery plugin where when you click this little box, it launches a color picker. But you see that I'm using these things in many different places throughout the application. So as opposed to having to, instead of having to put this DOM structure in every single place in my application that I want to use it, I just have one simple little tag and I'm creating reusable components. And that's one of the best things about directives is that they're reusable and they're compact and they're, you can pass in different variables to them. Here on the sides, I have this file uploader here, and I also have this file uploader here. And both of them work the same, but they're bound to different models. So the left side is bound to, creative skin left image, and this one's bound to creative skin right image. So you can reuse your components all over the place, pass in different attribute values, and then they sort of change what they control. So I'll save that. That's it. And that's it. Anybody have any questions? Everybody understand directives? Ready to go bang some out?
It's like the upload directive saves so much work.
Yeah.
What's that?
The uploader directive saves so much work.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, here's the site resizing one I was telling you about.
That looks like fun, actually.
So this, I'm actually observing all of these different attributes here because I need to, if you change anything on that particular page, it has to recalculate the sizing of everything. So I have a lot of listeners on this one. This is just basic, JavaScript math stuff.
What did you find it to?
What's that?
What triggers the reset size?
Reset size is triggered by these, observing these attribute changes. So for instance, if I I crashed my node server.
Don't you have that command you told me? Keep it running when it crashes?
Yeah, but I wasn't running that. Okay, so kind of touching on what you were talking about earlier, I had a cookie set in my browser, and I'm actually not launching Angular the normal way, where you just sort of include it in the page and then write your controller. I'm actually bootstrapping it from the main index file. Okay. So what I'm doing is, this might be interesting to some people, I'll show you. This is actually how I invoke Angular. I say, this is sort of like document or a jQuery document ready, but instead it's Angular element document ready. And then I run a quick ping to my API using jQuery's get function. And I check to see if the person's logged in or not. And then I bootstrap my Angular application and basically fire everything up. That way I know before Angular starts whether or not they're logged in, and I basically set that value when it starts up.
Yeah, I thought you were gonna load the entire app and do that.
Oh, no. No. So, what was I going to show you?
Oh, so the login portion isn't in Angular then?
No, yes, it is.
It's just the other pages are loaded once the user's logged in. Other
Yeah,
pages,
that's like for a returning user, if you have the cookie set, it checks your cookie, pings the API, and relogs you back in if you have a valid session, and then it bootstraps the application. But if you don't even have a cookie, then it just loads up the login page. That was kind of one of the more complicated things that figuring out this whole bootstrapping process. When you get home, Google Angular bootstrapping, and you'll see all sorts of different ways that you can do it and things that you can do with it. Why you'd want to do it that way.
I was going to ask about your technique to get rid of the flash when it's loading data.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody's read Ben Nadal's blog. I don't know if I'm saying his name right. Ben Nadal or Ben Nadal. He has a really good tutorial about basically subviews, and rather than in your router, rather than passing in what your controller and your view is going to be using an ng view directive, he just passes an action, and then you have this route listener that says what is the action, and then passes around the route attributes, and then passes those on to your controllers, and your controller says, I want to listen for this particular action only. So in this app here, This section of the app only listens for is the creative action. And then the rest of these things are basically route parameters. So this is my sub action, my creative ID, and the section that I want to edit. So definitely check out his blog post on that. But he wrote these classes that allow you to manage better your views. And it looks like this, and you get, this is the main index page of the app. And what it's doing, it's using an ng switch rather than an ng view. Sub view is the value of this here. So in this app right now, there's only two. There's basically creatives and there's users. And by default, in my app controller, I'm setting the sub view to loading. So by default, all you see is this groovy little spinner here. Actually, it went so fast. We saw the beginning, the loading app. So nothing else is even loaded because I'm using ng includes for everything. So this stuff here doesn't even get loaded until one of these particular actions shows up. So it sort of helps eliminate that flicker effect that you're talking
It's a
about.
good strategy.
Yeah.
Can you spell out his name?
Yeah, it's actually I have it in my. I think it's BENNADAL.
Oh,
There's not a whole lot of people that are writing really good tutorials and more advanced tutorials on Angular so far that I've found, but he is definitely one of the best, I think. Let's see, I have it here. Yeah, okay, yeah, BENNADEL.com. Check him out, and then also check out egghead.io. You were talking about that earlier. Some really good video tutorials. The guy goes through, does like screen sharing basically of his code. He has some really good stuff on there as well. That's actually, I probably learned the most from him out of anybody so far. Some of the more advanced stuff, I like Ben's blog. You can tell like he's really using it in real world, super complicated type of applications. So he has some really good wisdom on there. So that's all I got. Anybody have any more questions?
Have you learned any new debugging techniques, like with Angular, that have helped? Because it's obviously written very differently.
I haven't. Actually, Todd told me about Batarang for Angular. I don't have it installed on it.
What's it called again?
Batarang works really
Batarang?
good. Just Chrome and just download and install it.
Yeah.
It lets you see your scope and what is associated with each scope.
Nice.
And you can kind of drill down, all the different layers and get really kind of deep dive down into it. Because I know the errors that Angular spits out, a lot of times you're just like, what is that? I don't know. I have no idea what that is. But Batarang helps out with that.
Cool.
So this example that you're writing here, this is all in one controller, right? Is that
Which ones?
just what you're showing here? This is all
No. There's nested controllers. There's an app controller.
right.
Which basically the primary function of app controller is to say, is the person logged in or not? If not, spit them out to the login page and manage this sub view right here, which changes my view. Every single one of these views has its own controller associated with it. So let's say I have, let's use the, I'll get really deep dive here. Creative is the actual page that I was showing you where you typing in the colors and the sizes and everything. That's this page right here. So it has its own control.